tonight. These two events are organized within the fellowships of Gibson Ncube, sorry, Gibson, who is an AFOX fellow this year at Oxford and who will be visiting us in May and June. And so we're trying to both publicize Gibson's research, but also about networking between researchers in the UK and researchers in Southern Africa on queer issues or queer African issues. So over to you, Gibson. You will introduce our two speakers tonight, and we will hear their presentations afterwards. There will be 15 to 20 minutes after that for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothée. I'm going to start by presenting the first panelist, Megan Fokirian. Megan's paper is entitled Mummy Water and Gender Fluidities in Contemporary Nigerian Literature. Megan is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Leeds. Her doctoral thesis analyzes representations of gender nonconformity in contemporary Nigerian literature through the figure of Mummy Water. Her research interests include post-colonial and decolonial studies, religious studies, eco-criticism, and environmental humanities, Afrofuturism, and also African futurism. Her published work has appeared in journals like the Journal of Commonwealth Literature and the Journal of the African Literatures Association. So Megan will have 15 to 20 minutes to present before we move on to the second paper. Megan.
Okay. I will share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's visible to everybody. Okay, great. So I'm going to be presenting an extremely abbreviated version of my doctoral research, which is entitled Mummy Water and Gender Fluidities in Contemporary Nigerian Literature. So this is just going to be the broad strokes. Feel free to ask about anything that comes up that you'd like to hear more about. So I just want to start by kind of talking through who Mummy Water is. This is a huge subject in and of itself, just because there's so much that's been done on her. But a brief overview, she's a water deity that is believed to have originated in West Africa, possibly around the Niger Delta region in Nigeria. And the kind of interesting thing about her is that she includes highly localized water spirits, such as spirits that dwell in particular bodies of water, streams, rivers, lakes, etc., but also a really wide-reaching complex of transnational water deities. And so as a result of that, she's kind of the combination of this singular figure of like the Mami Wata goddess, as well as this kind of multiplicity of Mami Watas and Papi Watas. So I find this interesting because, you know, the complex that is Mami Wata is not confined to a specifically feminine figure, despite the fact that her name means mother of waters, and instead kind of encompasses this transnational, transcultural, and like multi-gendered complex of figures. So she is linked to the global African diaspora through the transatlantic slave trade, as well as experiences of colonization and imperialism, and has been used to kind of theorize so many dimensions of human experience, particularly encounters with colonial others through the work of Henry John Druel, and a wide range of other subjects. And so that's kind of what made me start thinking about how Mami Wata operates in the text that I'm going to be examining. The image on the left is sort of the most popular image of her. It's got a really complicated and kind of interesting and problematic history, but it nonetheless is kind of the central image that comes up when you talk about Mami Wata. So if you want to know more about that, I can talk about it, but it takes ages and I've only got 20 minutes. So the aspects of Mami Wata that are relevant to my work, primarily relevant to my work, are her gender dimensions. And so something that I found really interesting was that Jill Salmons, in her work on Mami Wata, interviewed several people who had been visited by Mami Wata in their dreams, and this kind of experience is it's a sexual experience. She comes to people in their dreams and she has sex with them, and this is seen as kind of a visitation to her devotees. And one of the people that Salmons interviewed was a woman who said that Mamiwata came to her in the form of a woman, but that when she had sex with Mamiwata, she felt as if she had sex with a man. And so she felt it must really have been a man who came to her. And this ambiguity between, you know, how Mamiwata manifests herself, is she manifesting herself as male? Is she manifesting herself as female? Or does it matter, right? Or is she inhabiting some kind of fluid space where she transitions according to the moment and the need? And so that speaks to the work of Henry John Druhl, who's kind of the foremost scholar on Mamiwata, and he describes her as transcendent, transformative, transcultural, transnational, transgendered, and transatlantic. So obviously he's playing with that prefix trans, but he's highlighting the fact that she crosses all of these boundaries, as she's depicted oftentimes as a mermaid, and so crosses that boundary between, you know, half fish and half human, but also lives on land and water. She's participating in human lives as well as the spirit world, and she is, you know, both this sort of highly feminized figure of Mamiwata, but also the male water spirits, the papi or the daddy watas, and that kind of fluid space between. So this is just like a map that I am kind of slowly putting together in my spare time. And it's just marking the places where Mamiwata has been mentioned, has been found, or there are references to her or very, very similar figures. And I think that attests to the kind of transnational nature of Mamiwata, and also the history and the legacy through the transatlantic slave trade. So the three texts that I'm going to be talking about are The Virgin of Flames by Chris Abani and two novels by Kweke Emezi, The Death of Vivek Oji and Freshwater. So each of these texts incorporates Mamiwata directly through naming and imagery, but also incorporates a lot of her attributes through characters and through encounters that I think are kind of worth thinking through. So I use Mamiwata as this vehicle of kind of reading texts and uncovering linkages and connections that I think reading through her makes a little clearer. So the first text is The Virgin of Flames by Chris Abani, and it takes place in the city of Los Angeles. And I think that reading this book through Mamiwata kind of offers insight into the nexus of relations between gender and environment in a settler colonial state. And that nexus is highlighted through the Los Angeles River, which you can see images of here. I grew up in Los Angeles and I'm very familiar with the river. And I found when reading this book that it was kind of presenting a really interesting relationship between people and place. So in the novel, the protagonist is called Black, and he's kind of semi-itinerant, and he has very little in terms of material possessions. He's an artist and he paints murals. And the primary subject of his murals is Mamiwata, both in her mermaid form, described as draped on red couches, and also in her kind of more human form. But the interesting thing about these portrayals is that she's always portrayed with a mighty python dangling between her legs. And so this is kind of an oblique mention of that gender ambiguity, right? And that fluidity that she moves between. And this becomes the thing that Black so desperately wants to be, right? He wants to embody Mamiwata. He continually struggles with his own desires. He's in love with, or obsessed with, I think is better to say, a transgender stripper called Sweet Girl, and she tries her best to kind of help him work against the really restrictive notions of masculinity and gender that completely consume his sense of self and his way of being in the world. And while he tries to sort of move towards this more ambiguous or more non-conforming gender identity, it becomes really difficult for him because at every turn he encounters the very rigid and very oppressive gender structures that kind of dominate his understanding of himself and his understanding of gender and desire. So Mamiwata becomes this emblem of what he wants to be, and yet nonetheless he cannot achieve that. He cannot actually get to where he wants to be because he feels so constrained. And I think that this is relevant to the Los Angeles River because the river itself becomes, in the novel and in real life, this emblem of constraint as the subject of settler colonial oppression. This is a really long passage. You don't have to read all of it, but it's a passage from work by a scholar who looks at the history of the Los Angeles River, and he describes it in a way that resonates really clearly with someone like me who grew up there. The river is almost entirely encased in cement. It used to be a wandering waterway, but now it's just a cement culvert. Its water is mostly treated sewage and oily street runoff. There's very little wildlife. There's very little plant life. And for most people, the Los Angeles River is a joke. This is what Gumprecht says. And when I was growing up there, I felt the same. Like, I didn't even know we had a river for ages. But it becomes this thing that kind of just gets taken for granted as not worth notice, but also nobody really considers why it is the way that it is. And it is that way because it was encased in concrete to prevent it from flooding, so that it was easier to settle Los Angeles and, you know, build up and make profits and all of the things that come with settler colonialism. So this is an image of what the river looked like in 1931, just before they started to build the concrete culvert. This is what it looked like in 2015, and it pretty much looks the same now. So we can see the vast difference. And I think it's really interesting because the novel itself specifically draws a connection between Black and the Los Angeles River. In the first chapter, it explains that Black's journey from Pasadena to East LA was guided by this river and its ghosts. So this idea of ghosts is the river, makes the river a thing that can be haunted, first of all. And second of all, that it's not just Black's spatial journey from Pasadena to Los Angeles, but the journey of his life is kind of led by this river. And so we have these parallels between Black and the river, and then the novel goes further to create these parallels between the river and Mamiwata through the image of the python. The river is described as fighting its concrete prison, a fight which is ultimately unsuccessful, much like Black's sort of fight to resist against the violent heteronormative masculinity that controls his life. And the river is described as being like an overfed python turning sluggishly to digest its prey. So this python image, the python is a sacred animal of Mamiwata. And so we get this linkage between Black, the river, and the python, and through the python, Mamiwata. We can see this image kind of reflected here. So kind of raises the question, how do all of these things work together? In settler colonial studies, there is this, you know, assertion, a very clear understanding that settler colonialism deliberately works to control gender and sexuality as a practice and as a discipline. It is something that actively is controlled in order to maintain power. And Kyle White argues that this extends also to the environment, arguing that gender and sexual violence are ecological issues because all of these things, environmental oppression, human oppression through gender and sexual violence, through very restrictive ways to be, are part of undermining social resilience and collective continuance for predominantly Indigenous communities in settler colonial societies, but just to maintain control overall. So my argument here is essentially that reading through Mamiwata highlights these kind of intersections of person and place under the structure of settler colonialism that makes it impossible for both the Los Angeles River to run freely and also impossible for Black to actualize the self that he's striving so desperately toward. And Mamiwata becomes this kind of emblem that he moves towards, but also like a way of recognizing how impossible it is to move against these, not impossible, but how difficult it is to move against these structures that are continually dominating his life. So that's quite pessimistic, but to move on to the next text, The Death of Vivek Oji kind of takes a different perspective. And I think this text works a lot with the idea of visibility and embodiment. In the text, the main character, Vivek, eventually, you know, pushes back against these constructions of masculinity by embodying Nemdi, which is part of Vivek's whole self. This is a female self. And so it's not about transitioning from male to female, but being able to be both and neither at the same time. And Vivek in the novel asks, if nobody sees you, are you still there? And so this question of visibility becomes really important in the text, and Mamiwata offers an opportunity or a means by which Vivek can make Nemdi a visible self. So in the text, Mamiwata kind of operates submerged within Vivek's character. She's really famous as a deity for like capturing human beings and bringing them underwater to indoctrinate them or to teach them in her ways. And when they reemerge, they are changed. They are a different person with different powers and different attributes. And this kind of echoes in the text when Vivek's cousin first meets Vivek after Vivek starts to kind of take on more of Mamiwata's appearance and bodily attributes and behaviors. Osita describes Vivek as having something coiled in his eyes, coiled, recalling this image of the python, and makes Osita feel like he stumbled across worlds in much the same way that a devotee might be stumbling across the boundaries of the worlds of the human and spirit by going into this underwater sort of realm. And what happens in the novel is that Osita's relationship with Vivek actually broadens his sort of perspective of himself and allows him to kind of accept his own desire, his own same-sex desire, which he resists throughout the novel. And so what happens is Vivek not only manifests Mamiwata as a way of embodying Nemdi, but also has this kind of ripple effect on the people around him and creates this space where Mamiwata can operate sort of outside the singular character of Vivek. Eventually, Vivek gets to the point where he can manifests Nemdi not just internally, but externally as well, embodies Nemdi, to the point where Nemdi can go out into the market dressed as herself, no longer having to only be Vivek. And she's recognized for who she is. Strangers, bystanders on the street recognize her and describe her as having long Mamiwata hair, right? This direct connection to this really kind of fluid and, you know, I don't know, difficult to pin down goddess. And she walks like a model. She looks like one, thin arms and sharp cheekbones. So we get this embodiment that makes Nemdi visible in a way that Vivek previously was not able to do until he begins to kind of commune with and channel Mamiwata through him. So I think it's just an interesting way of kind of reading how Vivek shifts towards Nemdi and towards embracing Nemdi if we kind of look at it through this lens of Mamiwata. Within the text, there's this really interesting usage of names as well. So we have Vivek, who's the titular character, who eventually is able to kind of embody and manifest Nemdi and becomes not a transition from Vivek to Nemdi, but an encompassing of Nemdi within Vivek. So Vivek becomes Vivek Nemdi OG. And then Vivek's grandmother is Ahuna, right? And Ahuna, the implication is that Vivek is Ahuna reincarnated. And this is seen as transgressive both in the novel and in many readings of the novel, because reincarnation is not supposed to transgress gender boundaries. Ahuna is a grandmother, Vivek is a grandson, and therefore Vivek should not be able to be Ahuna's reincarnation. But when we look at names, it becomes interesting because Ahuna is a name that means one with the body of her father, implying that Ahuna either resembles her own father or is perhaps a reincarnation of him. So already a reincarnation that traverses these gender boundaries. And then Vivek becomes the reincarnation of Ahuna, and Vivek comes from the name Viveka, and Vivek is half Indian, comes from the name Viveka, which describes this distance, this discrimination between the real and the unreal, the self and the non-self, the permanent and the impermanent, implying that Vivek has this kind of ability to recognize that which is the self and that which is imposed on the self, the external expectations of who Vivek should be versus who Vivek actually is and insists on embodying. And then the name Nemdi means my mother is alive, a variation of Namdi, my father is alive. So we have these reincarnating cycles, right? Where Ahuna is potentially a reincarnation of her father, Vivek is a reincarnation of Ahuna, and Nemdi is some kind of incarnation of Vivek. And this, again, this traversing boundaries is a characteristic of Mamiwata, particularly when it comes to the boundaries of gender. So naming kind of reiterates this passage. And then finally, again, I'm just running through this to get through within 20 minutes. But the final text is Freshwater, also by Akwaeke Emezi. And this text is about continual self-creation, which aligns with the kind of Igbo cosmological concepts that Emezi uses as the baseline for their novel. The idea that in Igbo cosmology, the creative process is a continuous and an ongoing one, and that creation is never finished. And in this novel, the protagonist is continually creating herself through bodily modifications, through different spiritual kind of realizations, and her ability to commune with the various spirits that live within her. And in fact, these spirits assert that the combination of both male and female and non-gendered spirits within the protagonist, called the Ada, means that this collection of entities exist between the inaccurate concepts of male and female. Right? The space between life and death is resurrection. And this goes back to that idea of reincarnation and also of crossing boundaries, of refusing a sort of normative or linear conception of, you know, what it means to be a self, what it means to create a self, and what it means to be gendered. So by the end of the novel, the protagonist begins to alter her body as a way of manifesting that which is inside on the outside. So we see this kind of fluidity happening with this character. And also, and this is where it gets into like kind of conspiracy theory mindset for me, this idea that this particular character is an unusual incarnation, both a child of Allah, the Igbo earth goddess, and an Obanje, something that defies a singular definition, not just a child of Allah, not just an Obanje, but something that moves between the both, someone who moves between the both. This next passage, I kind of debated whether to include it, but it basically creates these really convoluted webs of kinship that define the main character's relationship with gods. So it argues that the main character, the Ada, her mother is Allah, the Igbo earth goddess, but her mother is also Santa Marta, who is also Philomena Lubana, who's an Afro-Caribbean goddess, and that somehow this goddess is linked to San Elias, who is the Baron of the Cemetery, who is also Eshu from Yoruba cosmology, and yet who also guards Allah's womb. So we get this really, really convoluted connection of all of these different gods that kind of just leaves you like, what, at the end of the passage? But I think if we work through it, it kind of is a refusal of this singular idea of identity, a singular idea of lineage, and a singular idea of kinship and relation. So the question is, who is the Eda's spirit mother? In Igbo cosmology, Allah is potentially the mother of Mamiwata, and Mamiwata is the mother of Obanje, and the Eda is an Obanje. So theoretically, Mamiwata should be the Eda's mother. However, in the novel, Allah is described as the Eda's mother, which raises the question, who is Mamiwata? Where is Mamiwata? But then also Santa Marta is the Eda's mother. So we get this really complicated point where we have two mothers who are kind of vying for power, but the mothers themselves are actually related to each other. I put down the transatlantic sections and the Dominican section because I thought I would have time to get through it. And then I realized that was completely unrealistic. So if you want to hear more about the different ways that Mamiwata sort of transforms her iterations around the world, I'm happy to talk about it. But what this takes us to is going back to that question, who is the Eda's spirit mother? And more importantly, what happens to linear kinship and human genealogies when gods get involved? The Eda is Mamiwata's daughter, and Mamiwata is Allah's daughter, and therefore the Eda is Allah's granddaughter. However, the Eda is also Allah's daughter. Therefore, the Eda is Mamiwata's sister. Thus, the Eda is Allah's daughter and granddaughter, as well as Mamiwata's daughter and sister. So again, it's this kind of multi-origin point, multi-connection, and also none of this is actually based on biological reproduction. It's not claimed that the Eda's body is produced through the Allah birthing her out of the earth. There is an acknowledgement of the Eda's human mother, but that mother is also never positioned as a true mother. So it disrupts these notions of really linear kinship and linear relation, and it also disrupts the notion of genealogy as a whole. By the end of the novel, the protagonist says, I do not come from a human lineage and I will not leave one behind. I have no ancestors. There will be no mediators. Rather than trying to track her legitimacy through this kind of lineage that verifies her unwillingness to exist anywhere other than between the inaccurate concepts of male and female, she refuses that altogether, and she just claims herself as her own ancestor. There will be no mediators between myself and my ancestors because I am my ancestor. So it creates this really reimaginative approach to, you know, what relation is and what filiation and affiliation can be. And I know I'm over time, but the last point is that each of these texts kind of returns to the idea of the river, and always as this idea of a riverine future, right? A future that is tied to the river. In Abani, despite the fact that Black is unsuccessful in achieving sort of the ambiguity and the fluidity that he's constantly striving for, the novel doesn't end with his death. It ends with the river, and it says that permanence is this river, there will never be no more river. The same thing happens in Vivek Oji and Freshwater. This return to the river of time in Vivek Oji. The novel's called The Death of Vivek Oji, but despite the fact that he dies, he is a narrator, he's the protagonist, and by the end of the novel, Nemdi is already alive somewhere else. In Freshwater as well, the final realization, and these are all quotes from the final page of the text, the final realization in Freshwater is that the Ada is her own source, right? All fresh water comes out of my mouth. I am everything that I have chosen to be, and I don't need to rely elsewhere. And so I think Mamiwata kind of creates this vehicle for kind of thinking through how all of these reimaginings and these connections kind of come through in the novels. And then this is a picture of the Los Angeles River today. So it actually does have greenery, even though it's still kind of depressing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan.
Don't know how to stop sharing my screen now. Okay.
Thank you so much, Megan. We'll move on to the second presentation by Nogenda Zwelithumile Dungani. Nogenda is a provocateur, a writer, a scholar, activist based in Stellenbosch, South Africa. Their academic pursuits focus on the intersection of Black metaphysics and the ecological world as pivotal sites for the exploration of queer subjectivities within the framework of African queer studies. Their master's research focused on Black queer joy and the focus on spiritual embodiment and human sexuality. Their presentation today is entitled Spiritual Embodiment and Human Sexuality Among Sangomas in South Africa. So Nogenda had some technical issues and will be presenting without their video. Nogenda.
Thank you so much, Gibson, and greetings to everyone. My name is Nogenda, and I'm an MA candidate from Stellenbosch University, South Africa. And I'll be presenting part of the work that I'm doing for my master's project. And the title of my presentation is on spiritual embodiment and human sexuality among Sangomas in South African townships. And this is part of an ongoing project. So I hope that after this engagement, I would have gotten some insights from you guys, and you guys would have also gotten some things from me. So I'll just start. One of the difficult questions that Christina Sharp asks in her books, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, is what it means to work with the dying and the dead. And in the case of the work that I do, to do work that revisits the dead that is not dead, the dead that refuses to die, the dead that threatens to die. She asks, what does it mean to defend the dead, to tend to the Black dead and dying, to tend to the Black person, to Black people, always living in the push towards death? It means work. It is work, hard, emotional, physical, and intellectual work that demands vigilant attendance to the needs of the dying, to ease their way, and to the needs of the living. Vigilance too, because any and everywhere we are, medical and other professionals treat Black patients differently. And somewhere else, Stella Nyanzi posits that the canvas of possibilities demanding queer production of knowledge from Africa includes relationships, pleasure, intimacy, parenthood, education, voice and expression, representation and visibility, housing and shelter, movement, migration, exile, Islam, employment, income generation, livelihoods, family, ritual, health, spirituality, religion, faith, violence, security, safety, nationalism, ethnicity, and globalization. And big in emphasis on spirituality, religion, and faith. And drawing from Sharp and Nyanzi, I extrapolate and make an assertion that the theorization of Black queer people needs to be treated with careful precision, moving away from the trope of epistemic violence that seems to asphyxiate African queer studies. Because as Sharp puts it already, any and everywhere we are, Black, and I insert, queer people are treated differently. And South Africa is considered one of the most progressive countries when it comes to the protection of protecting the rights of queer people constitutionally. However, it is not a secret that being openly queer in this country still puts one in a precarious situation. There are still hauntings of violence perpetuated by cis patriarchy that's putting queer people in awkward positions of having to transgress, disrupt, and protest what CB calls draconian violence. But nevertheless, that is not the only thing that can best describe queer lived experiences on the African continent. Queer people can queer without dying. Queer people can queer without being raped. Hence, the examination of what queer people do when they are not confronting the invisibilization that embodies itself through the misgendering, tedious process of gender-affirming markers, dealing with dilemmas from bathroom signs, rejection from family members, and frustrations that come from the politics of dressing up. Queer people can experience joy, pleasure, or even pain in ways that do not perpetuate this epistemic violence. I argue that the metaphysical world, specifically spiritual embodiment, can be read as a site for these possibilities. Because in African spirituality, practices such as ubungoma, which is ancestral initiation, horelwa, which are naming rituals, and the Ogbanji or the Abiko spirits that comes and go, can be read as sites in which those queer subjectivities take place. And for this particular project, queer sangomas are of interest because of how spiritual embodiment allows them ways to complicate gender and sexuality, not only in ways that are transgressive, but also in ways that embrace the fluidity of human sexuality, and also open avenues for thinking about Black queer joy, freedom, and pleasure. The idea is not to homogeneously define what queerness look like in Africa, but to find alternative readings and nuanced meanings of how non-heterosexual people queer in Africa. And for me, as a queer person who also is a spiritual calling, this work is important as a way of countering erasure, but also to show how one can theorize from the mundane vernacular experiences of queer people as a way of rewriting the narrative and redressing the lies that have been told about queer sexuality in Africa. And the institution of Bungoma has been extensively, the institution of Bungoma has been extensively explored in anthropological work on African indigenous systems, but few scholars have explored the institution's theoretical potential for indigenous sex/gender theorization. However, using the biography of Nkabinde, scholars such as Mkasi, Nkabinde, and Morgan, Stobie, Van Klinken, and Odu have begun to explore what prospects lie dormant in this underexplored site. I focus on the institution of Bungoma as a site where we see the anatomical and the sacred interact in ways that Western dominant and sex gender frameworks and discourses have been unable to articulate and capture fully. An Ikrecha or Isangoma is someone that has gone through the process of Fukutwasa, which is a form of spiritual training and initiation. Initiates must be called to the institution through their spirit guides or ancestors. They cannot join on their own accord. Sangomas are primarily concerned with diagnosing sickness and unwellness, whether it's spiritual and or physical, and prescribing treatment for the said diagnosis. So through the process of Bungoma, I seek to locate queer in Africa outside of the lenses that view it as queerness as debauchery and violent, and framing of it as a Western import. I'm thinking about ways to theorize from queer people's everyday realities, desires, and practices without rehearsing the dominant discourses and tropes of violence. And through the studying of the lives of queer sangomas in townships, I'm interested in African spirituality and its relationship with homosexuality, especially how spiritual embodiment influences queer dissident desires and performances. And for geographic purposes, townships are of particular interest because of the kinds of queer possibilities and livabilities that they provide, which are otherwise unattainable in other spaces. Townships and their occupants often discussed through the narrow framework of violence and trauma imposed on queerness. And by looking at how queer sangomas navigate their sexualities and gender performativities in those townships, the intention is to explore how the embodied and homoerotic desires and performances can also be induced by the spiritual world, thus complicating the relationship between human and non-human practices, allowing diverse non-heteronormative gender identities and sexual practices. And so queer people with embodied spirituality usually find themselves in a liminal space between what is human and non-human, and that produces different performances of their gender and sexuality. And I'm interested in the sexuality and gender performativities in South African townships through Ubungoma to look at the same-sex and cross-sex possibilities and or limitations that African spirituality invokes for queer people. This is to think about how the fluidity of sexuality is not geography-specific, but can transcend geopolitical barriers, as those homoerotic patterns can be found in different specialities. And I'm interested in the possibilities and limitations that these specialities produce for male or female same-sex livabilities, socialities, and invisibilities, and what this means for theorizing African queer studies. Tamale posits that in order to understand sexuality, one must think of it relational to gender, as these are both societal and cultural constructs. They both play a crucial role in maintaining power dynamics in our societies. She argues that gender provides the critical analytical lens through which any data on sexuality must be logically interpreted. So the case of Bungoma makes this more interesting with how, for example, a heterosexual body can enter a path, which is the initiation process, performing a cis-heterosexual hypermasculinity, but come out performing their gender in a way that is oppositional. Another example would be how a cis heterosexual performing male sangoma can have sexual relations with the opposite sex, but dress and perform gender roles that society deems acceptable only for females. And this means that the practice of ubungoma problematizes how queer can be understood in the African context, where it is often said that kwamoya, which is the spiritual realm, there are no identities like race, gender, or sexuality, thus allowing for a fluidity of gender and sexual identities. In his thesis titled Imfihlo, Buhlebezwe conceptualizes ubungoma as a practice that allows a multiplicity of being, the idea of being neither here nor there, the floating between human and unhuman. And through Siwani's thesis, one gets to see that ubungoma and queer sit well next to each other as part of the same feather. In ubungoma, the ancestral guides of primary value, which means that the living being will be called by the ancestor to inherit their gift. As a result, the ancestor spirit will manifest through the body of the one that is called, which is Isangom. And that means that the called one must do everything that the inherited spirit wants them to do, including having same-sex relations with their counterparts if necessary, or cross-dressing, like in the case I made earlier on. And these acts are usually seen as unorthodox by society because in a heteronormative space, females are expected to have sexual relations with only males. And Akwaeke Mays properly explores these similar queer encounters in her books Freshwater and D.S. Sinthoran through the Ogbanji and Abika concept. In Freshwater, they write about how sometimes the main character, the Adam, would not have control over whom she wants to have sex with, but the spirit in her would lead her to have sex with both men and women. The Adam even goes to the length of surgically removing her breasts, a transitioning process that can be considered queer by many. A similar thing happens more often with sangomas, leading to male sangomas dressing and exuding female traits and vice versa. And this goes as far as cross-performing gender roles and expectations, something that is read as queer in this work. One cannot think of a new South African dispensation without mentioning Soweto as one of the foundational geographies in this country. Soweto can be seen as a place where people look out for each other, where there's a deep respect for religion, tradition, and culture. And Soweto as a township space where queer sangomas reside is not only known to evoke performances of masculinity that are often violent, but also allows for homosexual and homoerotic performances of gender and sexuality. So township spaces like Soweto act as spaces in which same-sex and cross-sex desires and homoerotic aspirations are queered. Within these townships, there are indumbas, which are initiation houses that are confined compound spaces that partially free the human body from its suppression by patriarchy and the normativities of heterosexuality. It is easy for one to think of these spaces as ways of disciplining and training bodies, especially if one thinks of it from the Michel Foucault's theorization of power concerning sexual identity. And in thinking with Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, performance, we're looking at these, the compound places that queer sangomas find themselves in. One gets to notice how when gender intersects with sexuality in a confined space, the idea of fluid sexuality becomes prevalent. Especially how the search for safety and security in the spaces can invoke certain performances that complicate and problematize traditional notions of gender and sexuality due to spiritual embodiment. And the queering of the spaces and practices through spiritual embodiment is important for the way it challenges what masculinity and by extension heteropatriarchy is and how it can be rethought and reimagined. And in the South African context, the reading of these townships and their relationship to spirituality is important because in 1998, South Africa legalized same-sex relations in the country, intending to make both heterosexual and homosexual people equally enjoy the rights ascribed by the Constitution. However, the country is still faced with a high number of homophobic violence cases, especially affecting those outside of urban areas. These violent acts have made it difficult for queer people to be freely visible in their sexual expressions. And this has led to them having to find private spaces where they can freely express themselves while feeling safe and secure. And South African townships offer contradictions for queer livabilities at a face value. They seem to be spaces where homophobia prevails, while at the same time they allow queer people to explore and perform gender and sexuality as this sit at the nexus of many people's social world, that's uniquely allowing freedom of expression. And in this master's work, I was interested in how these townships facilitate freedom and joy for these queer people. This is also inspired by Eddie Ombaki's work on spaces Mbagi problematizes the question of what this invisibility means for queer livabilities. Writing about these private yet public spaces in Kenya, Mbagi further asserts that these kind of spaces allow for queering and queered flows that make it possible for queer users to subvert the spaces and make it possible to read, locate, and recognize queer subjectivities within them. So just like the taverns and clubs in Kenya that Mbagi looks at, the townships where queer sangomas reside in South Africa often offer a reading for the contradictions of queer livability on one hand and queer visibility on the other. Ombagi's argument speaks to what rights explore in queers in space, communities, public spaces, sites of resistance, where they look at the relationship between queer livabilities and queer activism in communal and public spaces. Their work engages social spaces that allow homosocial relations like parks and beaches and how they shape queer identities. And in this research, this research expanded from that work by looking at township spaces to investigate how they built on those identities and livabilities. Their work invokes questions about the meaning of communal spaces for queer people and the significance of public spaces for social invisibility. What this shows is that the places and spaces that allow for the queering of gender and sexuality also enable people with marginalized homosexualities and identities to survive and to gradually expand their influence and opportunities to live fully. And queer-friendly public spaces available today offer a basis for survival, contact, community, and sometimes even communality and sometimes even community that began. And this is what those township spaces provide for sangomas in South Africa. They offer a counter-narrative to the dominant discourses on queer expressions that usually equated with sexual immorality or social degradation. The spaces recuperate such negative assumptions of queer lives and practices to more positive and affirmative tones of community, friendship, and celebration of love and or Black queer joy. Yeah, I think I'll end for now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Narendra. And we could hear you perfectly. Okay, if you have questions, this is a meeting format. So actually, if you have questions, you can raise your hand and you can ask the question yourself and turn your camera on if you want to, or you can just post it in the chat. It's well, entirely up to all of you, I guess. So yeah, Megan and Narendra will have 15 minutes to answer the questions. If while you sort of recover from these incredibly exciting but also intense presentations, I think I have a question actually. It's a question to both Megan and Narendra. It's a quite general one, but it kept coming back when I was listening to the both of you, which is when you think about this sort of articulation between the self and the spiritual or the invisible, where do you, if at all, where do you locate the idea of community, the idea of the collective? So we're talking a lot about fluid selves, about the self being the self, but also other, about these processes of transformation, about hidden sources of power that, allow the self to become what it really was, but also to sort of protect itself from social injunctions. How do ideas of community and, collectivity and solidarity enter in these in the works you're looking at or in your field works?
I can answer that first, unless Narendra, you want to speak?
No, it's okay. I'll go after you.
Okay, just speaking directly to the texts that I worked on and am working on, I think it's an interesting question because each of these texts is in many ways very almost hyper individualistic in the way that the characters are portrayed. I think perhaps the exception to that is the death of Vivek Oji, where Vivek kind of has community based more on I think just a broader sense of difference. I mean, he's mostly in community with the other children who are called the Niger wives, right? These women who are non-Nigerian women married to Nigerian men. But that community then becomes a space for him to be like loved and safe and all of that. But I think the tension there is that it seems one directional in the novel, right? It's mostly flowing towards Vivek, which is not really how, you know, we conceive of community at large. I think it's interesting as well because Emezi, as an author, talks about how their work is intended for those people who have had experiences similar to their own, and in some way that their work is supposed to operate as a space for building community, perhaps community that's not in physical proximity to each other, but community nonetheless, like communal feeling. But I think it's interesting how their work almost seems to defy that in the way that the characters themselves operate. And the same in Abani's novel. I think basically my answer is that in the text that I work on, that isn't it. I think these texts are perhaps, I don't want to say prey to, but inclined towards that hyper individuality that is a lot of what defines the author's environments. Both authors live and work in the United States, and also the particular environments of their individual characters. So I don't know if that's a very good answer, but.
Thank you. Thanks.
Oh, okay. And I think in the work that I'm doing, one of the interesting things that I found was how the institution of Ubongoma sort of provides this kind of kinship or community for these queer sangomas, because you find that so if the sangoma gets to go into an initiation house, there's going to be like a mkulu, it's called mkulu, which is like the initiator, the person who's managing the whole process. And then this becomes this new family. So there's like aunts, uncles. So this sort of like also gives them this opportunity to have this family relations and this collective communal support.
Wonderful, thank you. Luando, if you have a question, would you like to unmute and ask it directly? Turn on your camera if you can.
Thank you, Dorothy. Good evening, everyone. I think I don't really have a question. No, I do actually. I do have a question on the agenda. But I think the other thing that I'm actually picking up here is just the thematic of methods. There's a very common thread between these two presentations that actually raises just this issue of methods. And I think it's very fascinating how they bring along that kind of conversation around the kind of methodological work that they're actually bringing on the platter. And I'm saying this because I'm noticing something about how often when they speak about, for example, new forms of queer representations that are perceived, for example, with the Mami Mata, Megan's presentation, they quickly run into issues of transgressiveness, or rather modes of resistance, and they shy away from the ideas of new forms or methods of new forms of representation. And I think this is what we often do as queer people when we're thinking about these kind of the eccentric or the unusual kind of representation and displays. That every time when these kind of new methods of of representations are actually brought forth, we quickly say that they're actually transgressive or they're resistant or they're fighting, instead of actually saying, or not even instead of saying, or instead of actually viewing them as the kind of new methods of thinking about ways of livabilities for queer individuals. And I think Not Gender actually raised this as well to say, often as queer people, or rather as when speak about queer narratives, we are quick to actually want to fight against this kind of gender binary norms when thinking about our new ways of representation. We never want to think of these new ways of displays as ways of thinking about narrativizations of queer individuals, or new kind of perspectives that we can think of them as passages, or rather pathways of thinking about what it means to actually be queer and narrativize a queer kind of epistemologies. That's the first point. The second point, I think that's something I was raising to to Megan, about quickly shying away from this very narrative of thinking about always these fluidities as kind of aspects or ways of fighting against this gender binary norms, but instead we can also think about them as passages of forging new ways of queer representation. That's the first one. The second one is basically gender. I think both of you have actually done a very fascinating study. But I was thinking about ubungoma as a method, and particularly gender raises issues of, or rather thematics around joy, freedom, and modes of satiation. And I think he quickly delves back into issues of how ubungoma challenges the very notion of, or how we can use ubungoma to queer certain spaces and challenge these binary nodes or challenge these kind of heteronormative domains, instead of thinking about ubungoma also as a new kind of methodological kind of framework that we can adopt in terms of speaking about new ways of channeling ourselves as queer individuals. I think that as well, if we can possibly look into that kind of spectacle and ways of going about thinking about joy as that which doesn't necessarily constantly have to be that doesn't have to stem or rather emanate from constantly having to fight for particular spaces, even though these spaces are actually deemed as heteronormative, or these spaces are very brutal to queer individuals. So I wanted him to actually maybe elaborate or speak more about the kind of thinkings around the methodological work in and of around this very idea of ubungoma as that which can possibly bring about new ways and new narrativizations of queerness. Thank you, Dorothée.
Who wants to get started? Who's filling up for it? Najenda, can I put you on the spot?
Oh, okay. I was still trying to digest what Nadia just said. But yeah, I think that's, especially the last point that you made, I think that's a very interesting point, because part of the inspiration of the work that I'm doing was really around the use or thinking of the Black metaphysics, which is like African spirituality, things that happen in the metaphysical world, as a site just to see if as a site to see if we can find any possibility, i.e. queer joy, exploration of possibility of exploration of queer joy, freedom, and pleasure. And that's why I mentioned things like the Ogbanji and the Abiko, some that concept that originates from Nigeria, or Hurelwa, which is like a practice that is prevalent among the Sutu natives. So I think that's an interesting point, and I guess that's what I'm interested in with this project. And I'm hoping that by the end of the project, I would have succeeded in thinking of this institution as this site / method / framework when thinking about those possibilities.
Thanks, Najenda. Megan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point and definitely an important one. I think part of the problem is I got way too ambitious and tried to squeeze too much into 20 minutes. I think particularly with the work of Emezi, there is a focus on new methods of kind of, you know, you were talking about like new methodologies and things that are not focused primarily on resistance, but on new, you know, ways to narrativize and ways to like kind of think through queer being. And I think actually Emezi's work oftentimes is not, in both novels, I think I've framed it incorrectly. They're not about necessarily resisting dominant modes in the text, right? It's not that the characters are in conflict. It's that the texts themselves are kind of thinking through alternative ways of being. So in Freshwater, the, you know, as Nojenda pointed out, the kind of Obanje, Abiku structure becomes the method by which the text and the main character thinks through what it means to be multiple, what it means to depart from what she had initially, I guess in some ways it is resistant. She initially starts out with this idea that she should be a sort of singular feminine person and comes to realize that the complexity within is something that just, it's not necessarily resistant to other modes. It's just a way of thinking through being and making, you know, this sort of agender or ungendered being possible. And in the text, it foregrounds these kind of ebo-cosmological concepts to the point where it treats sort of medical interventions like breast reduction surgery as almost like an afterthought, almost as though that's the alternative explanation for what's really happening, and what's really happening is spiritual embodiment. And in Vivek Oji as well, there is no mention of terms that would, you know, there's no mention of transgender, there's no mention of transition, there's no mention of, you know, medical kind of biomedical structures. Instead, and if there was a mention of that, I think it would feel more like it's resistant, right? This is what is dominant and this is what I'm doing to resist the dominant. Instead, in Vivek Oji, it is simply, I am thinking through my being through this kind of spiritual model and the spiritual mode of Mamiwata and embodiment through like this, the spiritual embodied within the bodily that then creates new bodies that can be lived and lived visibly. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think that Abani's text is very much invested in this really like combative resistant mode, but I think in both of Umezi's texts, there is at least an effort to move away from that and to establish a new method and a new way of thinking through being.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I might have another one. And here, maybe it's more for Nojenda, but I don't know, Megan, if you feel like it resonates as well. I don't know much about Ubungoma beyond what you just said, Nojenda, but I was just wondering how this practice, and I hear it's a, I mean, I think what you say is it's an initiation ritual. I wonder if how the concept of healing comes into that practice. Does the idea of healing or repairing or something that has to do with well-being, does that intervene at all in the ritual and also in the sort of approach of queer people to these rituals?
Okay. I'm thinking of a way to frame this. But I guess the institution of Ubungoma, obviously healing takes place because so the institution is Ubungoma or Ubugqirha, and then there's a Sangoma, an initiate to graduate, then they become a Sangoma. But there's people have different gifts. So one can have a gift for healing, one can have a gift for prophecy. So it's different gifts. So with how perhaps they sort of like interfere with these queer livabilities, I guess because it becomes that continuation of like the spiritual position or spiritual embodiment, because you find out that if the ancestor, the one who's possessing this living human being, if they had a gift, then this gift will then be transferred into the one who's now living. So I don't know if like I'm trying to think of how to frame.
I don't know. I think it's really interesting how healing can come into play into this. The idea of, you know, healing also by making connections with the spiritual world. And so I wonder to what extent trying to think about as well, which is, you know, you start Tina Sharp ideas around notions of Black death and violence inflicted on Black bodies, etc. And how it's also important to, you know, look at queer joy and celebrations and ways of living and being that are not connected to these ideas. And so that is also the context in which I was thinking about healing these rituals as creating community and fomenting joy, if you want. But Megan, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to say in regard to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, so I gave like the briefest summary of the Mamiwata intro, but like a big part of the kind of construction of Mamiwata is through this idea of healing, spiritual, physical, and mental healing. And that's kind of her primary role on a daily basis, on, you know, interacting with people who need healing. And I think that comes across in the text because there is this emphasis on healing, even though healing is not always successful. There is an emphasis on healing as the kind of primary focus for most of these protagonists, even in Freshwater, where healing is not necessarily so obvious. The journey that the Ada kind of goes through is a journey of self-healing as a direct result of this kind of ritual engagement and personal engagement with the spiritual. In Vivek Oji, healing becomes, you know, the Vivek embraces Mamiwata and sort of the spiritual dimensions of his being because he seeks healing. He's seeking healing for what he feels is an imbalance internally, a spiritual imbalance internally. And so it becomes this mode of connection that brings them in contact with this kind of spiritual figure that then gives them the potential to heal, even if they're not always 100% successful with it. In Chris Abani, it's much more, in Virgin of Flames, it's much more complicated. It's a character who is continually trying to heal others, but is unable to heal himself. And so it kind of feeds into that more pessimistic turn that the text takes overall. But there is this kind of undercurrent of spiritual healing as the mode of connection.
Thank you. If it's time, so if Nojenda and Megan are happy to stay a few more minutes, because we have one question in the chat, and Wando has raised his hand again, or their hand again. If you're happy to tag along, I'm very happy with that, but I don't want to. If you have anything else to do, please let me know. But I'll read Belinda Dodson's question. Belinda, who also has Bye, Ellie. Belinda, who was also saying that she is the editor of the Canadian Journal of African Studies and would be happy to receive articles on queer African studies. So get in touch with Belinda, and she's put the link to the journal in the chat. But so Belinda has a question, which is, I was struck by the implicit and explicit geography in both presentations, the Los Angeles and other rivers, water, and fluidity as metaphor, and the significance of place, like Soweto. Could each presenter reflect on how they got there, i.e., was it there from the start, or did it emerge during your research? Can you push it further in your ongoing thinking?
I can take that first, Nojenda, so you can have a bit of a break. So with mine, I think particularly the Los Angeles thing, it was a bit of an indirect arrival. I read the book and was struck. I think the thing that struck me was how the book talks about the Los Angeles River, and it in most of the descriptions of the river, it just talks about it as a normal river. And I remember being confused because I remember that river and I was like, that's basically just a drainage ditch. Like that's how it gets treated. I would never talk about it the way that it's being talked about in this book, and how characters in the book were like, and it sounds really, really minuscule, but characters in the book were completely uninterested in the fact that it had rained, which in Southern California is like the topic of conversation for weeks before and after the rain happens. And I was like, I know Abani lived in Southern California and is aware of that. And so I was like, I wonder if there's something happening there. And then I started looking into it and I started finding all of these really unexpected connections between the city of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles River, and like the Mamiwata figure, and how those things were weaving themselves within the text. And it made me think a lot more critically about a space that I had never really considered critically before, because it was a home that I've left quite a while ago and doesn't often feature in my work. And so starting to think about how fictional representations of place aligned or didn't align with personal experiences of place made me start being much more attentive to how this book was complicating easy assumptions about that particular place. And it also turns out there are really random like iterations of Mamiwata. Someone named an ice cream flavor Mamiwata at like a gelato shop in LA. There's a surf shop called, like, it's just a really strange, you know, once you start noticing connections, you start picking up on them more. And so I think it has definitely pushed me further in my thinking and made me want to work more on, you know, thinking critically about how place is operating within these texts and where that can take me.
Thanks.
okay.
Nojenda, yeah, go for
Okay,
it.
thank you. I think with me, Soweto. So when I was conceptualizing my MA, I had to localize my work so I can be able to do empirical research. And because Soweto is one township that I'm familiar with, and one way I had been to, so it became easy to just, okay, let me go to it. But also the fact that there's a lot of scholarship on queer performativities and queer livabilities in Soweto. So I wanted to see the link between the spiritual embodiment and sort of like link it to link it or see how it fits into the existing scholarship or existing literature on Soweto as a place. And now that I've been doing the work, I'm also thinking about comparing or seeing or thinking about the differences or similarities between what happens in those townships in relation to spiritual embodiment and what happens outside of those townships. So it's also something that I'm thinking about post the MA project.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think we'll wrap it up here, if that's okay. Thank you, Nojenda and Megan, so much for your presentations. They were amazing. I've learned so much, and it was such a pleasure listening to you and listening to you answer the questions. Thank you very much to Gibson for organizing this, you know, and finding us these beautiful speakers. It's much appreciated. Thank you, all of you, for attending tonight, for listening, and you know, sharing with us this moment. I wish you a wonderful evening. I hope you can join me in thanking our presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Very welcome.